This is Ray Stokes in the rare book room of the TCOM library in Fort Worth on the 18th day, I believe it is, of July 1989. I am very pleased this morning to have a very good friend that I would like to recognize and welcome at this time, who is the Assistant Vice President of Administrative Affairs at TCOM. And he's a veteran employee, and I'm going to clarify this term veteran because I know of 3 campaigns, building campaigns that is, that he's been through. So we'll get him to identify those and clarify some of those campaign skirmishes that he's had down the last 15 years. He came to work for us here on the 2nd day of January 1974. May I introduce to you Ken Coffelt. Ken?
Well, thank you, Ray. It's a pleasure being here
this morning.
I'm looking forward to this.
Well, good. I'd like to just ask you, Ken, I know you're from Oklahoma, and you came to Texas, I guess 25 years ago or thereabouts. Where'd you grow up, and where'd you go to school?
Well, it was a small town, southern Oklahoma, by the name of Waurika.
Waurika. Mm-hmm.
That's
close, not too far from Wichita Falls.
It's kind of northeast of Wichita Falls, just across the border.
Right.
And south of Duncan.
Right.
I'm trying to get you oriented there because not many people have heard of Waurika, Oklahoma. But that's my little hometown. I grew up there. Graduated high school in 1952 and went directly into the Army at that time, and served some time in Japan, Korea, and Okinawa.
As long as I've known you, Okinawa?
Yes, I finished out my tour of
duty
there.
What years were you in Okinawa?
53, 54.
A few days ahead of you. I was there in April 1, 1945.
That was the big one. That was the big day, yeah. And I came back and I went to school started in the fall of 1955, school at Oklahoma University.
Mm-hmm.
And
I've heard that you play a little football up there.
I was fortunate enough, or unfortunate, whichever, to have played a little ball there, and was never.
Who was your coach?
Bud Wilson.
Bud Wilson.
But I need to certainly clarify the fact that I was not one of the All-Americans there. I simply did not have that ability, and just one of the also-run players. But I enjoyed playing there, and it was quite an experience, and it provided me the skills that I needed to go on and do what I wanted to do all my life, and that was to be a coach and a teacher. That's what I wanted to be. Mm-hmm. And so I took a degree, my bachelor's degree is in education with a major in biology.
Mm-hmm.
And I started teaching in 1959 in Oklahoma City at U.S. Grant High School, where I was also assistant football coach and head wrestling coach. Wrestling is kind of a story in itself.
Oh, yes, and it's very prominent in the state of Oklahoma.
It's very popular up through Oklahoma. As a matter of fact, either OU or OSU has been the traditional NCAA powers in that sport for years and years.
Right.
But I started there and teaching, coaching, and enjoyed that. It was a good life. I enjoyed it, but I could see that because of my nature, I was not going to be able to pursue a lifetime in coaching. I simply could not leave coaching the job at the job. I lived at 24 hours a day, and it was killing me.
Yeah.
Oh, in the summers I'd gone back to OU and was working on a master's degree and completed that in 1965. And as well as some hours above the master, and was fortunate enough to then get a job down at the University of Texas at Arlington in the biology department, teaching biology.
Still weren't in biomedical,
no, I hadn't gotten there yet.
Got into communications, huh?
And started teaching there at, it was Arlington State College at that time, 1965.
Right.
We moved to Arlington. And At that time, they were experiencing a growth, a spurt of growth in student enrollment, and within the biology department itself, the head of the biology department felt that he had a grave concern that the students in the basic courses were not getting the same kinds of material, particularly in labs, because different teachers teaching their different specialties. So he wondered if we couldn't put together a laboratory introduction on videotape, which was a fairly new concept in '65, particularly in schools. And so he came to me because I had done a little teaching on television in Oklahoma City. I'd been involved with a Ford Foundation grant there where we were teaching biology over broadcast television, educational network. So the head of the department, Dr. Meacham, came to me at UTA and he said, we'd like for you to put together a television system for our freshman laboratories. And of course I thought he surely was joking because I knew nothing about television, and other than the fact that I'd been in front of the camera. And I told him I knew nothing about it, and he said, well, you know more than we do. So he said, it's your baby, and so I got busy and learned television as best I could, put in that system, and it worked very well. We were assured then that all the students were getting the same introduction, the same critique of the lab at the close of the lab, so I think it worked very well. And about there, I was there 2 years, and then it was at a meeting. A fellow was demonstrating television over in Dallas, and I won't name the company, but he was, and invited a lot of people. And I went to this television, and this guy was really saying some things that weren't quite kosher. He was, in my mind's eye, he was misleading people. And it was obvious, since this was a rather new educational tool, that the educators in the audience didn't know that they were being misled. And so I began to question some of the things he had said. There's a great big fellow sitting right behind me that I kept hearing going, you know, and I thought, this guy's wanting to get out of here, so I'm going to shut up after a little while. Well, anyway, as it turns out, that was Chuck McKinney, president of the Tarrant County Junior College South Campus, even before it opened. School had not yet opened. And so he talked to me after that meeting and said, just out of clear blue sky, he wanted to know if I'd be interested to come to Tarrant County Junior College to be their television director. And I was stunned.
I see.
Oh, I thought about it about 30 minutes and said, yeah, I think I would. not that, I'm being a little facetious, but I went over to Tarrant County Junior College as both a biology teacher and a director of their television, educational television system. And incidentally was the very first faculty member to go to work at TCJC because of my part-time appointment.
You have something in common with me.
Right, yeah, we share.
First.
We share, yeah.
Right, yeah. Well, how long did you stay at TCJC?
I was there 6.5 years.
In other words, you came from TCJC here.
Right, yeah.
How did you get interested in medical education?
Well, that too, it shows how our careers are sometimes influenced by so many different things. I had a call one day there in my office at Tarrant County Junior College from a gentleman who identified himself as Marion Coy. He said, I am president of the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine. He says, have you heard of us? And I said, truthfully, sir, I have not. I don't know anything about you. Well, he said, I wonder if I could come out and visit with you. And I said, well, most assuredly, because Tarrant County was really known nationally for its media. Television, video, photography and graphics and all of that. We had developed quite a large reputation, so we had a lot of visitors. It was not unusual for this to happen. So Dr. Coy came out, and I thought he wanted to see the campus, and we toured the campus, and I showed him all of the media stuff that we were doing, and we were, at that time, very deeply involved in self-paced instruction, so that students went to the Learning Resources Center and retrieved the material. We called them packages, learning packages.
Right.
And so we toured around, and Dr. Coy was very interested, and so we got back to my office, and he said, I'm going to come right to the point. He says, would you like to go to work for me over at the college? Which I thought was kind of neat, him offering me a job there in my office.
Right.
So I said, well, I'd like to see what it's like, and so forth. Well, I came out, we set a date, I came out and visited, and I'll tell you this, Ray, it was quite a shock.
I bet it was.
You know, you remember what it was like in '74.
Well, certainly, but you walked into the bowling alley.
I walked into the bowling alley, and he said, now, let me show you where we think we could make space for you, for your department, if you'll come out here and build a biomedical communication department. We didn't call it that then.
Yeah.
We used instructional media because that was the preferred term at that time. And so he took me across the street, across Clifton Street, over to what is now the Medical Examiner's Building. And right next to the autopsy theater, and he said, now here are 3 rooms. Now, can you think you can fit your organization into these 3 rooms? Well, I was coming from one of the most modern, up-to-date media delivery systems that there was in the country at that time, at least in the Southwest. And I don't know what there was about it, Ray. The challenge. He told me at the time, we were a private institution at that time.
Right.
And Dr. Coy told me that they were making every effort to and it looked good, that they would become fully state supported at some in the near future. So I guess what I did is I liked the challenge of starting from scratch. I liked the idea of medicine with my degrees in biology, being associated with medicine. And of course, I like the idea of, I've always felt like I'd rather be a big fish in a little pond than a little fish in a big pond. Now, you know, I'm just, and I like the idea of doing that. So I agreed then to come over here, and as you said in the very beginning, I showed up for work on January the 2nd of 1974.
Well, you're a 15-year veteran now.
Yes, yes.
But you have more than that as far as state affiliation is concerned. How long you been with this, either between Oklahoma and Texas? How many years have you?
I've been in the 31 years in the business,
Yeah.
Educating. 30 years, and then I've bought some of my military time, so
I see.
For as far as teacher retirement, I have 31 years.
Well, now, when you first came to work, you had a little office there in what was part of the kitchen at the, in the old bowling alley days. And they had a restaurant.
Yes.
You had a little desk or something right there, in close to the admissions office, as I recall, the way they had it organized at the time. And that's where you operate from, with just a desk. And
Yes.
You did a lot of drawing and planning and so forth. When did you actually move over into? It was actually the Central Clinic, we call it.
Central Clinic,
3440
yes.
Camp Bowie.
Yes.
That's where they had the first, not the first clinic, the second clinic, but we call it the Central Clinic. When did you actually move into there, and what?
It was about
How did that develop?
a couple of months after I had arrived, so that would have been March. I think it was around March or April, because we were still. The drawing that you mentioned there was, I was trying to put together how we would modify that area in the back of the old Central Clinic.
Right.
To accommodate a television studio, a graphics production area, a place to store equipment, to check out for faculty use and that sort of stuff. So that was part of what I was doing in that drawing. But I think we moved over there, memory serves, it was March or February, March.
Seemed like we had open house long about the 1st of March, wasn't it?
I believe it was, along in there somewhere, yeah. And I think we were in over there at that time,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you were.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sure you were.
Oh,
Well, you've developed a great deal in that, since that particular period of time. When did you begin to build your department?
actually from before I came, and that was in beginning to talk to some prospective employees. And I had a fellow who worked for me. He worked for a contractor, but he was doing work for me on South Campus, TCJC. I'm very impressed with his knowledge and skill, and particularly in television. But he had a lot of other skills that fit right in the media field. For example, he was an excellent photographer, which he did as a hobby.
You must be talking, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, you must be talking about Bob Combs.
You know exactly who I'm talking about,
Right.
yeah. Oh, I had talked to Bob about the possibility of coming over here with me, and he thought about it for a while and finally decided that that's what he'd like to do. He had been at Southwest Med School prior to going to work with this commercial concern. And so Bob was actually my first employee. He came with me, or shortly after I was employed. Then we went through the formality of getting him employed, and then we hired a secretary. And I think the next person we hired then was a lady, forgive me, I cannot remember her name, but she did our graphics, drawings, and that sort of thing for us. And then I believe we hired Bill Roberts.
Yeah.
Who was next, and Bill is still here.
Yeah.
And Bill is the guy that kept all the machinery running and working. And
You didn't
helped
have at
us
that
install.
time too much machinery.
Didn't
did
have
you?
a whole lot, but I will say this: I was very pleased with Dr. Coy had promised me that if I came over, he would do what he could. He never gave me a figure, but he said, I will be as generous with you as the budget will allow. Because he said, I want our faculty to have the use of this kind of material in their teaching modalities. And so Dr. Coy was true to his word, and he gave me a lot of support.
When did you get a little more beyond the work in your department? You got involved in campus growth to a great extent. And I mentioned earlier that you have survived 3 building campaigns. When did you get involved in the first campaign, which we call Med Ed 1, that was finished, I guess, in '78?
Yeah. Ray, it's kind of interesting. Almost from the day I got here, I began to be called upon to meet and to work with people here, because I had state experience. I had experience at UTA, and I had experience at Tarrant County Junior College with state-supported and or publicly supported institutions. And we were moving toward statehood, if I may use that term. The school was. And so there was a need, they were for advice, counsel, whatever. So I began to move into those kind of administrative areas purely by default or accident, simply because of the past experience. And then I was made assistant to the, I've forgotten his term, but Dr. Foray came down from North Texas.
That was after we
became a state institution. And Dr. Foray, Gus Perret, recognized that I had been working in these peripheral areas administratively, and so he said, well, I'd like for you to be my assistant. So I became his assistant. And,
well, tell me, let me interject this question here. You know, the year or so that Gus was down here, of course, he was known as Jitter Nolan's chopping boy or whatnot, you know. And what relationship did you have? You say you was his assistant. What relationship did you have with Gus, and what contribution do you feel like that Gus may have made since we were an infant as far as the state institution was concerned?
It'd be difficult for me to really judge what his overall contribution was, because in all probability I only saw a very minor part. But I think the thing that he did do was to begin to move our thinking more out of the private and more into the way one operates when one is state supported.
Right.
And maybe even to the extent that some of the organizational changes that he made were designed to help us become a productive state organization. I have very good rapport with him. We worked well together, I thought, and I had no idea if he had any hidden agendas. I've heard many things over the years, but I personally did not see any hidden agendas that I've heard others speak of.
Well, as we began to grow, and your responsibilities grew with it, of course, when did you learn that you were commissioned to be in charge of
building buildings?
Building buildings, right.
Boy,
particularly start with Med Ed 1.
Well,
now we're overlooking just a little gap in there, because we did in '75, in September of '75, we became a state part of we called it the medical branch of North Texas State University is what we called it.
All right. Dr. Willard came on board, if you'll recall, then as the first, I guess, president of the state school. He was not called president
not
then.
At that time.
That time.
No,
he came as a dean, vice president and dean.
Of academic affairs.
Yeah. And so I had been, like I said, I had been Dr. Ferre's assistant. Well, Dr. Willard, shortly after he got here, said, well, I'd like for you to be my assistant. So I served as assistant to him. And of course that meant as his titles changed, my titles changed.
Right,
but I continued to do my full-time job as director of biomedical communications, but I was also serving as his assistant. And one of the things that he said he wanted me to do was to, I'll use his words, I want you to bird dog the construction of Med Ed 1. I don't think, he simply, the design and all of the control for the development of that building was done by North Texas people who were sort of on loan to us.
Right.
And I don't know what his thoughts were, but he did definitely wanted, let's say, his person involved. And so he asked me to set in the meetings, to work with the planning directors up there and that sort of stuff, but to keep him informed.
In that respect, did you do any close work with Jack Robeson when he was here?
Jack and I were very close, yes. I thought the world of Jack. And I think Jack probably, I mentioned a while ago that Gus Ferre was instrumental in changing our thinking from private to public, and I think Jack definitely contributed to that.
Ferre.
Right. He was really the one that began this whole thing of getting our finances straightened up, or not straightened up, but set up in such a way that. Then that's really how I got into the being involved with the construction program. And then the people at North Texas, the planning director, Larry Luce, and others were continued to be involved in the construction of Med Ed 1 through its completion.
Speaking of Larry, is he still at North?
Yes, he's still at North Texas. And so I guess in Med 1 I was kind of peripherally involved, and yet I was right in the center of it. I was the one who made the reports, let's say, to the president down here, and the president's council down here. So I learned a lot in that building. I had a lot to learn. And I think, though, in retrospect, of the three buildings, Med Ed 1 was the smoothest. It, of course, came in 18 months ahead of schedule.
That's what I was going to try to
We couldn't believe that we were thinking about occupying that building in such a short amount of time. The general contractor did an excellent job.
Who was the contractor?
Rooney and Associates.
Rooney.
Yes. Florida-based,
Yeah.
headquartered in Florida, and they did an excellent job. Now, one of the things that's rather unique about Med-Ed 1 is it's one of the very first large pre-cast buildings in the Metroplex.
That's right, I'd forgotten that.
There would have been many precast buildings in this area. By precast, I mean all the parts are poured, the concrete parts are all poured somewhere else, trucked in,
Right.
and then hooked together like a giant erector set.
Right.
And this was one of the largest, first of the large ones. And there were quite a number of people upon its completion who came by to take a look at a sizable or a larger building which had been totally precast. Well, the fact that this one was precast, I think, one of the reasons that it came in earlier, ahead of schedule, completion schedule. Mike Miller was the general contractor, the building superintendent for the company, and he really did a magnificent job.
You remember what that building cost?
Oh, Ray, yeah, taxing my memory here. I want to think it's in the 12 million bracket.
Yeah, I think that's a close ballpark.
It was partly federal funds and it was partly state funds that built it. But
how were we able to get federal funds? Do you recall?
I truly don't.
how
I
that went
really
about?
don't. I don't. It was. No, I won't even hazard a vague recollection, but.
We need a man who's retired now, who was head of our physical affairs that you worked with for several years, L.L. LaRue.
Yes.
He might tell us something about that.
I'm sure, because he certainly had a good memory,
Right.
and he would.
Well, he
was
came at a time
involved.
when
he
we
was,
needed him.
Yeah, oh yeah, and he was involved in that at that time in getting the grants, and I forget now how long we were state before he came.
Well,
not too long.
He came in '77.
Was it?
Yeah,
Okay.
'77.
Yeah.
So we'd had a couple of years behind us.
Yeah.
But he came at a very opportune. Well, I say opportune. He
Well,
came at a very crucial time.
Crucial time in our history.
Right, he really did. And he too. People have mixed feelings about his reputation, but he came. He made an excellent contribution, I feel.
Well, I think the record will show that your assessment is absolutely correct. That he
much?
brought with him a tremendous amount of state experience.
Right, and he really knew how to.
Yeah. How to use the system, work the system
That's
as
right.
it should be worked.
That's
I
right.
don't mean that in any derogatory way. But,
Right,
so, yeah, he was a part of our history and a vital part of it.
right. Well then, how long had we been with Med-Ed 1? You got everything cleared up with that when you start thinking about Med-Ed 2?
Well, let's see, we finished Med 1 in '78, and then we had already started. We started planning Med 2. I believe it must have been about that time, shortly after that, because we started construction on Med 2. I believe it was in 82. Ray, you're going to have to help me here. Your memory.
I'm going to rely on you there. I didn't do too much research.
Well, it was
81, and our lieutenant governor broke ground, didn't
Yes,
he? Hobby.
Governor Hobby came to break ground, and I might mention it was a little bit more, the weather was a little nicer than it was when we broke ground for Med-Ed 1.
Oh, yes.
You
let's
remember
go
how
back to
cold
Med-Ed
that
1.
was?
Right, because...
Rainy and
well, I wasn't here. You know,
cold.
Dr. Willard and I had both gone to the AOA convention in San Francisco, and he had to fly back, for that. So I missed that cold day.
Well, it was quite a...
About the 16th of November, if memory serves me correctly.
Yeah, well, again, I will rely upon your memory in that regard. But it was a very cold, rainy day. We had groundbreaking ceremonies for Med-Ed 1.
Yeah.
And, it was a marvelous time. The excitement of building and moving into new quarters in our school to me, as I look back on it, and I say that was the beginning of this.
Before we completely
Real
leave
school.
Med Ed 1, tell us a little bit about the destruction of the basic science building known as the bowling alley.
Oh boy, that was something to behold. Well, it's one of those things, the staging of this construction was critical because we occupied and we had to continue to operate as a school while we were building our new building right next door.
Right.
And Med Ed 1 sits in a location that what used to be occupied by a hotel, a motel, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. It's
Right.
called the Colonial.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
a Colonial Motel.
Yeah.
Well, and the bowling alley was just to the east of that motel. So we had to build the building while we still occupied the old bowling alley, which was that was the school. And so that was in itself quite a feat. But then when we made the transition we moved into Med Ed 1, and that move had to be done almost overnight.
Yeah.
We had to shut down on Friday and open up again on Monday.
Right.
So we tried moving everything over a weekend. And we weren't successful, but we got close. Then I guess it was like one of those greatest shows on earth. We all got to sit around and watch the great big wrecking, the bulldozers and things come in and start wrecking the old bowling alley. And I think there was some degree of feeling of loss there.
Yeah, right. I think you're correct.
And I remember, Ray, that you and some of your people selected a number of bricks
Yeah.
from that building and cleaned them and made mementos of them.
Right, about 150 of them,
Yeah.
I think, something like that.
And I think there was a sense of excitement moving in, but there was also a sense of loss, as if we had lost some of our heritage.
Then we began our campus was spread out considerably then at that time, wasn't it? Tell us about
well,
the
we
bank
had-
and down on the river.
We had some of our operations located down in where the Texas American Bank is now, down there in that corner in a vacant bank building. I know that our business office was located down there, purchasing office,
Right.
and I believe manipulative medicine
Yeah,
was down
you're right.
there.
And I was down there.
And you were there, right?
In development.
And so we did have a fragmented. We simply didn't have the space to locate all those things here on our campus.
You never had an office down to River Plaza, did you?
No, I was here, always been here on the main campus.
Yeah.
But we leased some space at River Plaza to do a couple of things. One was to begin to teach some more of our basic science courses down here, which had been taught in North Texas, and also to locate the library. If you'll recall,
Oh, yes.
our library was located down at River Plaza.
Yeah.
People have to get ready for that when you stop and think about it.
That's right.
Our college library was 2.25 miles from the campus. That takes some getting used to.
Yes, it does. Sure does.
And then there were some basic science departments that were located down in the River Plaza building.
Yeah.
And then our physical plant operation began to grow naturally.
Yeah.
Our purchasing department grew, central supplies, central receiving. Then we got into the print shop business. All of that had to have a home.
Well, there's
And that was
something
located down
unique
there.
about that. You remember we were in a bowling alley on Camp Bowie. We were below a bowling alley.
Yes.
If you were over across the street
Right,
there.
the River Plaza
River
area.
Plaza. The bowling alley was on top of the.
We have an affinity for bowling alleys,
I
don't we?
guess we must have.
Yeah.
All right, let's. How long did it take to build Med Ed 2? Now, you have the same.
Yes.
Same contractor?
Yes, they were a different name. This was Great Southwest. However, it was a subsidiary of Rooney, and so we had the same general contractor and the same superintendent, Mike Miller, who built Med Ed 2 for us. And again, he came in below schedule, a little under schedule, but not 18 months. I think he was 6 months under schedule on Med Ed 2. Now, the difference for me in Med-Ed 2 was that in Med-Ed 2 I was totally in charge of the planning, and that is working directly with the architect and our own family here at the institution. And
In other words, you had no particular assistance from North Texas.
no,
Other
than as
Mr.
required.
Denny came down. What's
Yeah.
was his name Denny?
Don Denny. He came actually in Med-Ed 1. He was he actually was an engineer that oversaw the construction, that is, to make sure that the things were built according to the specifications. And he brought a fellow with him, Milton Schultz. And of course Milton,
Milton's still with you.
still with us, and retired once, and we brought him back out of retirement to do Med-Ed 2, and then he just stayed on to do Med-Ed 3.
Right.
So, and he's been a tremendous help to me.
Yeah. Now, how large is Med-Ed 2?
Oh, gee, Ray, I should have done my homework.
Well,
25,000, roughly 25,000 per floor times 5 is what? 125,000 square feet, something like that.
Right. What did that building cost, you recall?
I think it was around 16 million.
It was more than the...
More than Med-Ed 1. It came at a different time. There's a lot more... the cost per foot for the Med-Ed 2 building was more expensive than 1 because there's a lot more plumbing and that sort of thing, which is very expensive because of the research aspects and because of the fact that it was a teaching facility primarily.
It's basically the basic science building.
It is the basic science building, and so you know its cost per square foot was considerably more, although I don't recall the exact amount. And of course, then when we had Med-Ed 2, we truly then were able to bring together the entire, all of the basic science into one basic area, with the exception that we continue to have a close agreement with UNT, particularly in biochemistry.
Well, now tell me, let's focus our attention for a minute now on biomedical communications that you have developed and fathered it all the way through. When did you begin to expand? I mean, after you were in a very fine space on the 7th floor, I believe, there in Med-Ed 1, you began to have innovative ideas about certain things you could do with television and teaching and so forth. Give us a little rundown on how you developed that, because you and Bob played a very important role in that. Long about that time you became an author, didn't you? In that respect?
I had
written a book in that regard.
I had written a book on the installation and utilization of instructional television while I was still at Tarrant County Junior College, and it had been published by the University of Texas Press and had become, I don't know whether it was an authoritative book or not, but it had a wide audience. It was rather well received and used by a lot of people who were contemplating putting in little educational television systems. And after I came out to the medical school, I got a notice from the people at the University of Texas indicating that it probably needed to be updated since this field changes so rapidly.
Right.
And so Bob and I'd asked Bob, I said, well, gee, I don't really have the time to go through it from top to bottom, and particularly as it concerns the engineering aspects, the technical aspects, so why don't you co-author it with me? And he did, and so we really just revised it. I don't know if that book is still in print or not. I kind of think it's not, because this field has changed so quickly.
I should have that in the rare book room here, shouldn't I? You mean, is that
I don't even have a copy of it.
You don't?
I really don't.
My goodness.
I had a couple of copies, and I don't know, I gave them to someone. But the thing about the growth of biomed, we provided a service. I want to make that clear, that what the people in my area in that department did, and the thing that we talked about constantly, is to provide a service. And if you're doing that, if what you are providing has value, the people will gravitate to that service. And that's how we built that department. We did not go out and try to sell it per se. We didn't corner people in the hallway and say, hey, have you thought about trying to use a couple of slides here? What we did was that we'll produce quality slides for you. We'll produce quality videotapes for you and whatever. And if you find a way in your teaching methodology to use those, we'll support you 110%. And I think it was that alone, because the one thing that we had going for us here is that doctors realize the value of time. If anybody does, it's doctors.
Right.
And what we were proposing was, if you will use our methodology, our tools, if you will, we think that you can cut down the amount of time it takes a student to learn a given block of information.
I see.
And that's to your advantage. And our faculty grasped that very quickly. Gee, you know, the old adage, a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Right.
Well, they'd rather show the picture than repeat the 1,000 words.
Right.
And so it really grew of its own volition after it had gotten started. The credit really isn't mine at all. The credit for the growth of that department of the good people that we had working in that area.
In that respect, I wonder how many. It's grown considerably. What's the number of personnel in that?
You know, I have no idea how many. There are about 15, 16 along there now, and of course that started from the two or three that we spoke of a while ago.
Right.
And it really, they're the people that make it work.
In their field too.
Oh, they are indeed. They're experts in their field, and they're the ones that make it work. Now, over the years, we've had a number of people who have, we've had employed in that area, and then they went elsewhere. You expect that. Good people will.
Well, I know nothing whatsoever about television other than just being able to turn the TV on, and then I have trouble sometimes. But I've had the pleasure on a number of times taking visitors and friends through the department, and even when we were over on the 7th floor. I did it more then than I do now, actually, but people were amazed at the setup that we had to compete with Channel 5, 8, or 4 in this area if we could. Well, let's see, Ken. We've taken pretty well care of Med Ed 1 and 2, and you were certainly you were involved in all 2. Now let's turn our attention to Med Ed 3. Can you think back about some of the factors that were instrumental in?
We did. Well, first of all, we selected the same architect, Fisher and Spillman, out of Dallas, for all 3 of these buildings. Though there was that commonality there, that thread of continuity in the architectural concerns. Well, in company with members of that staff from Fisher and Spillman, Mr. Carter, who's Director of Library Services, and myself, in both the role as planning director as well as media, biomed communication director, we visited a number of other institutions, medical libraries here in the state. San Antonio and Galveston are the 2 that I recall vividly. Looking at not only what they were, but how they were set up in order to serve the patrons. This room that we're in now is a we call it Rare Books room, is very similar to the one in Galveston Medical School. I recall that Mr. Carter and I and the people from Fisher and Spillman visited that. We were just so impressed with that Rare Books room down there. But that's just an incidental. I think the main thing we were trying to achieve was a functional operation, and we were also trying to achieve flexibility and future growth, so that we could expand, as we know a library will always expand. And of course, I had the good fortune of having constructed or built kind of from ground up two other media applications, biomed communication
Right.
type applications. So the building of this one, and again, I relied heavily upon the people who worked for me at that time and to design the media or biomed communication part of this building. And they did an excellent job, I think, in terms of functionality, how the various pieces fit together to produce a functioning, efficient department. I'm very pleased with.
How large is?
Stand by.
Ken, I guess you remember that in the discussion about the library and all of the politics involved, and there was quite a bit of politics
Yes, there
involved
was.
in it, and in fact, I think that's one of the reasons why Dr. Willard might not still be here, because of some of the involvement that he got into that was in disagreement with some of his superiors. And I won't go into all that detail, but nevertheless, he was instrumental in helping us get some funds, that we might not have gotten for a while. How much involvement were you in that particular aspect?
Just peripherally,
Yeah.
simply with an understanding or knew what was going on and what we were attempting to do. And I think the whole thing was we went directly to the legislature for the funding to do Med-Ed 3. And
How much did we finally wind up getting?
I believe it was 14.3 million, something of that effect. And so that was issue that came directly out of the legislature. And I think that perhaps Dr. Willard did. I don't know exactly how to say it. He was deeply involved in getting that. He felt strongly that we needed a new library, and I'm not sure he was able to convince others of.
Right. The others
The
weren't
need.
opposed so much as they felt it was a little early to
Yes.
make that attempt.
Yes.
Well, I understand, of course, you know Dr. Baum, Elmer Baum down at Austin. He, of course, played a very important role after, in other words, before the governor, he had the opportunity to do a little line vetoing, as I understand. Elmer Baum
Yes.
played a pretty important role in helping us keep that.
I understand.
All
that
right,
was,
we've got the money now.
Yeah.
You got a different contractor entirely now. You're
Yes.
starting out with some new international company from France, I believe, wasn't it?
Yes.
You had a lifetime experience with this one.
That one I hope to never ever repeat again, or have to repeat again. That was and hopefully we'll edit this. I'm having the doggonest time remembering the name of the company. It just flew away. I had it on the tip of my tongue.
Well, they were from France.
They
weren't
were from France. Their parent company was located in France, and they were a company that was headquarters over in Dallas. Now, at the time, Texas was experiencing a tremendous building boom, and the parent company wanted to get in on part of the American market, and they felt Dallas was a good place, and so they established a subsidiary here. And they were the ones who got the low bid. They had pre-qualified for the bid and had built done some good work here, and in the U.S. And so we began construction of the building. There were not any at that time basic problems, but as we began to progress in the construction of the building, the fellow who was the president of this local subsidiary indicated to me that they had made a corporate decision that upon the completion of this building, they intended to close their office here in Dallas because the construction industry was falling off. And I asked him at the time to be sure to keep that under his hat. In other words, don't broadcast the fact that you are going to close this office because we'll have trouble with deliveries, we'll have trouble with everything. And in his wisdom, he elected to make it known publicly, and perhaps he was right, I don't know. I'm sure it would have gotten out anyway. But that, in my mind's eye, is where our real problems began. Because then we had subcontractors that were leery of doing the work for fear of not being able to get paid.
I see.
And so it really, before it was all over with, during the final stages of construction and so forth, I felt like my only job was to counter the flow of paper that I was getting from the contractor, which I readily knew, and I think anyone would readily see, was simply laying a paper trail for any future litigation. These guys were far beyond their completion date. They were over that date, and there were penalty clauses, liquidated damages and that sort of thing that could become involved. They were far over budget. They were losing money. Of course, it didn't bother us because we had a contract that says we will pay so much. But then again, when a company starts losing money, they start trying to cut corners. And we had a hard time working with those people toward the end of that contract because they truly did go bankrupt. They got out once they'd finished this building. And then we had to rely, they left a holding company here to fulfill their obligation for the 1-year warranty after the completion of the building. But it was not Soji, Texas was the name of the company. Soji, Texas, one word. And their parent company was SGE in France.
You have got a good memory.
Well, it took a while. But SGE was the parent company. Now, it's 3 French words, and I don't speak French. So they have since packed their bag and left, and I never hope I never have to go through that kind of turmoil again, internal turmoil, as well as trying to see that this institution, that we were doing what we were supposed to do and in the proper way, so that we did not run any risk of getting, first of all, inferior work,
Well, I was going to ask you,
but
the
beyond
workmanship.
that we weren't in any kind of litigation. And there was a implied threat of litigation because the company was contending we had done certain things which held them up, and this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Nothing more than paper trails.
Right.
Our attorneys and their attorneys would have had field days with it. But as it turns out, we were able to, we even called meetings with that company. I had a Board of Regents people there, our own Board of Regents, so that they would become acquainted with what was transpiring. And it was not pleasant by any stretch. Personally, I think that we did get quality construction, and I will give the credit for that to Milton Schultz. He was on them day and night.
He really bird dogged.
He bird dogged them. On this building, it was unbelievable how closely he stayed tuned in to this thing. And so I think if it were not for that, we would not have gotten, because I think they would have cut corners. Now, I hope I'm not saying something that's libelous, but
No.
they're interested in making money, and they were losing money. They told me how much they'd lost, and I paid no credence in it, but it was beyond $1 million to complete this job. They even brought their vice president or something from France over to meet with us on 2 different occasions to meet with me.
In other words, they didn't finish before their
Oh no.
agreed date.
Oh no. They were far beyond past the date of completion, which then brought into play the whole concept of liquidated damages. In other words, penalties for being over contract.
Right.
And oh, it was a horror story. But I still think that we got a quality building out of it, a beautiful building.
We certainly have, certainly have. Yeah. And the occupants in the building, in addition to the library, which covers the second, third, and most of the fourth floor, the biomedical communications, you share that with the computer people to some degree.
Yes,
I don't know just where they fit into the picture, but they're here.
Yeah.
In fact, they're on the fourth floor too, I believe.
They're both on the first and the fourth floor.
Right.
And
but you have I still associate you with biomedical communications, but that department, compared to what you had on the seventh floor, is much larger, isn't it?
oh yeah,
And
probably 4 or 5 times
the
more.
graphics department,
Yeah.
or section, I'm sure, is much larger.
Yeah, it is. The whole area, I'm sure, is 4 to 5 times larger than what we had over on 7th floor. And again, I think that is an example of how it grew over the years. The whole.
Do you have any particular experiences? I understand, in fact, I witnessed, I think all 3 times, didn't they have some, what they call tree topping?
Yes.
Do you recall any particular anecdotes or any unusual episodes that occurred during any of those tree topping experiences that we had?
Not during the tree topping. I didn't know what in the world tree topping was till we,
Well, I didn't either.
till we did it on Med Ed 1. But it's a ceremony or that tradition that goes back over many, many years. But no, I'll tell you, one of the things that stands out in my memory on Med 1 is the lifting of, as I indicated before, that these buildings are built kind of like in block pieces and giant erector set.
Right.
Well, one of the very largest pieces that went into Med Ed 1 is the great big piece right at the very top of the south end, right up on the 8th floor, the south end of the building. The largest single piece of precast concrete that went into that building. And it took 2 great big cranes to lift it. Most of the time, the pieces are lifted by one crane and set over, and then the workmen tie the thing together. This one required 2 cranes. And everybody at the school, there was some thought that the 2 cranes simply won't be able to handle it. And that there was this thought of it'll get up so high and tumble or whatever. Right. And the whole school turned out to witness it. We were all standing around looking, and everyone holding their breath, particularly the contractor. But with a lot of smoke flying and so forth, it set it in place. I remember that one. That always sticks out in my memory. The tree toppings, or the topping out ceremony, nothing in particular. That is more a tradition for the workers, the builders, the guys who are building it, than it is for the owner.
I made notice of that, particularly when they were finishing this building.
The contractor usually would provide the workers refreshments and meal and that sort of thing, and so for them it was a milestone.
Okay, now we've talked a little about the past and the present. How about the future as far as building and expansion of the campus? And you built, let's see, I haven't been there to see it myself, but the physical plant is in a building all of its own now, down on, what's the name, Darcy?
Down on Darcy Street, yeah. We 4,800 square foot building, which was really kind of a way to get the physical plant department up on campus and out of those leased facilities that we spoke of a while ago down on River Plaza area. But we intended, at the same time we brought those people up, we knew we were going to have to use some of those old houses that were still located down on Darcy Street. We are now at a point where it looks as if we need to be thinking about additional parking. Our parking situation has reached almost critical mass here. So we're thinking that what we need to do is to develop another building, similar to the one we built for the physical plant. Put the things that are currently housed in the old buildings down there, the old homes, into this new wing or new building.
Where will that
And,
likely be located?
Probably at the very corner of our property down on Darcy and Boland, right on that corner.
Is that
I
as
would
far
think.
down as we go? As far
Yeah,
as
our
ownership?
property line to the eastern boundary is along Boland Street.
On Bowling
And
Street.
probably will remain the boundary for years to come.
Yeah. And then along West 7th Street, do we have everything except one building there?
Well, in the 3500 block we do, well, I say not one building, we have half of that block, I would say. Llewellyn still owns those old apartments that are there, as well as his basic building on the corner of 7th and Montgomery.
Right.
So, but in that 3500 block, we own nearly
What do we have,
half
about
of the
12
street
or 14
frontage.
acres now?
We have 15.3 acres here.
15.3?
Yes, which is not a large campus by most measurements, but after all, it is sufficient to educate the 400 medical students
Right.
that we have. Now, if we get another school of something, it may be that there will be a need to expand our construction or the buildings, but right now we don't know that.
Yeah.
Now, we have a need for clinical space. And as you know, we just, February the 24th of this year, our Board of Regents accepted and approved a new campus master plan, which we had worked on for a considerable amount of time in conjunction with Parker Croston Architects here in Fort Worth. And that plan shows the mechanism by which we can expand the new buildings when that time need arises. And it seems that our clinical need is our greatest right now, space for our clinical operation, because we are the only publicly supported medical school in the state of Texas that does not have an affiliation with a publicly supported hospital.
Right.
And so our need to create patient flow upon which our students
Right.
learn
Right.
is different from the other schools who have a publicly supported hospital. They seem to generate all the patient load they need to educate those people, whereas we have a different problem in getting the patient flow. So our clinical need is large. We are looking now at the possibility of renovating the two buildings that are down on Camp Bowie and Clifton Streets. The old, what we call medical examiner's building that the county medical examiner occupied for a while. Incidentally, the old central clinic, as you recall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the what we call the old piano store.
Piano store.
And then, of course, sitting between those two is our current police headquarters station. And
Is that as far as we go east?
No, that vacant lot east of the piano store belongs to us.
I see.
And that's the eastern boundary along Camp Bowie there. But we're developing a plan now that we hope to present to the Board of Regents next month
I see.
for approval to do some renovating there on that corner for clinical use.
Right. Yeah.
The exposure to Camp Bowie for our clinics is very desirable. There are a lot of people who travel Camp Bowie each day.
That's right.
And so the visibility of a clinical operation there is highly desirable.
Well, Ken, we've gotten 3 buildings built this morning. In summation, I'd like to just reminisce a minute. And off camera a moment ago, we were discussing some of the experiences we had in the beginning of graduation time, for example. Do you remember our first graduation, where it was and under what conditions?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do, Ray. I think the funny part that I recall is that, as I remember, no one in our gathering, administration and so forth, had that much familiarity with how a college or an upper level commencement.
I don't think even Dr.
Conducted.
Hart knew that too
No,
well.
no. And so there was some question about the different kinds of gowning, you know, the master's or PhD type gowns.
Right.
But be that as it may,
Even had a few bachelors in there.
oh,
too.
sure, yeah. And so we collected in the lobby of the administration classroom building, i.e. the bowling alley.
Right.
And then we had policemen who were going to hold the traffic so that we could march across from our north side of Camp Bowie across to the Scott Theater over in the museum or cultural district. And we had our first commencement of 18 graduates. Memory doesn't tell me how many faculty were involved, faculty and staff in that first commencement. I don't recall. I know you were. I remember seeing you there, Ray. But
in fact, we had a number of volunteer clinicians, you know, in clinical sciences who were involved. But I'm like you. I don't know. I don't recall the number, but it didn't take very long.
Didn't take very long.
Bowie.
Crimp, yeah, right. With our 18 graduates and probably that or fewer faculty staff. But I remember that
We
there
had
was
2 years graduation, didn't we, in the Scott Theater?
I think then the
74 and
following
75.
year that we also had it there. Yes.
And then the third year, I believe we moved down to Will Rogers, didn't we?
I believe so.
And wasn't that the
And
year
then
that Jim Wright was our
I believe
commencement speaker?
that's correct. So that would have been 78,
No, that would have been 76.
76. Okay, yeah. I think that's right. That's right, yeah. So, again, I look back on that rather humble, modest beginning,
Right.
and I think of those 18 graduates, and I think many of whom I see now coming back at our alumni functions and,
Right.
and continuing medical education functions, and they're very successful physicians. They've been out now a number of years, and I think of how they received their training in almost primitive circumstances. It's easy to get on the soapbox and start talking about how those people went through a very primitive system and have turned out to be excellent physicians.
Right.
And I'm not saying the ones we turn out now are not. I don't mean to imply that at all. But I think those 18 graduates sure had a high level of desire, those students, to have committed to a 4-year curriculum in such primitive circumstances,
Right.
and not even knowing if it was going to continue to exist.
That's right.
In other words, the place could have closed its doors.
Particularly the first year.
That's right. Or even, and they didn't know it at the time they enrolled, but it might have closed after they had graduated. Then what would their degrees have been worth, figuratively speaking. So I greatly admire those first people who pioneered this.
Sure did.
And I admire people like you who came here early on.
I had a little finger, but you had a whole hand, and I commend you for the efforts that you have performed. And again, I want to thank you for giving me your time this morning to reminisce and be a little nostalgic about the past, and hopefully we think about continuing the future. And I think we have a great growth to look forward to. Good to see you again this morning, Ken Coffelt.
Thank you, Ray. It's been a pleasure.